All right, guys. Today we're going to be going over the Ruy Lopez. In my opinion, this is one of the best openings in chess, and you must absolutely know it in order to get to that next level. We're going to be looking at Mikhail Tal. He is the 8th chess world champion, one of the best Ruy Lopez players, and in general, probably the most entertaining chess player of all time. We're going to examine 3 of his most famous Ruy Lopez games and use that in order to actually learn the Ruy Lopez and master this opening. And now, what exactly is the Ruy Lopez, guys? Let's look at it through the lens of Mikhail Tal versus Wolfgang Unzicker, 1961 Stockholm. In this position, we see e4, e5, knight to f3, and then knight to f6, defending the pawn, right? So the whole point is we're attacking the pawn that is defended by the knight on c6. And there's lots of different options here. Like, for example, you can play bishop c4, the Italian, c3, the Ponzianzi, looking to push d4. You can even sack this knight and play the Irish gambit. There are so many different options. It's unbelievable. And if you were to play like the Italian game, there are 10 different variations that you could end up finding yourself in, like Guccio Piano. It's endless. The Evans gambit. But here, Mikhail Tal chooses the Ruy Lopez, which is his bread and butter. It's an amazing opening, and played at pretty much any level, right? Um, and the basic idea is this: like after a6, you can reroute the bishop, similar to this pattern you see here on the board. You can also just take the knight, and then you take back. Now you got to be careful. You can't take this pawn here, because after queen to d4, you just end up in a really bad position. It gets really scary here. It's not necessarily losing, but a big theme is that these two pawns are actually very difficult to take. Either way, Tal does choose bishop a4 because the prospect of going to bishop b3, not turning into a knight, but playing bishop to b3 or even bishop to c2, attacking some weak squares on the king side, is very enticing to most grandmasters. Either way, the knight comes out to f6 and we castle. Now, notice that the pawn is hanging, but similar to the position that we looked at earlier, if you were to take this pawn, we can push d4. And if you're taking that pawn back, here comes rook to e1, and you see the knight is now pinned and in a lot of trouble. If you were to ignore this threat and just move the knight back, yeah, d takes e, and you're in a lot of trouble here. You're not going to want that. Either way, you're not going to take that pawn at the Grandmaster level. Wolfgang Unzicker, he wasn't the 8th world champion like Mikhail Tal, but he's very good at chess. So bishop to e7. This is all theory. You're going to castle. We're already castled, so we're just going to put our rook on to e1. And the reason for this is simple. Now your pinning threats don't exist anymore, so this pawn is a target. And then after b5, we put our bishop back to b3, and d6. Now notice this: like the f7 pawn is a soft weakness, and Wolfgang Unzicker is going to want to do something about it eventually, right? Like he's probably going to want to castle. Um, Tal here is hedging his bets and playing c3. His whole idea normally is to push d4, open up the center, and then utilize his bishop pair to cause some destruction on the king side. And then, of course, if he was to add some pressure on the bishop, he'll reroute to bishop c2 and have an attack on the h7 square. In this situation, castles an h3, a preemptive move that's going to prevent this knight from coming to g4 as well as the bishop from coming. H3 is oftentimes a great defensive move that can even prepare a g4 push later on. Either way, the knight is going to go back to b8. It looks like an odd retreating move, but he's looking for d7, right? He's looking to reroute the knights and use this a little differently. We play d4 as expected, and the reroute is complete. At some point after the center opens up, the knight may be able to go to c5, and that seems the Wolfgang Unzicker's idea, trying to target maybe e4, which is going to be a weakness for the entirety of the game. Either way, we push c4. And pushing c4 is interesting because if pawn takes, bishop takes back, and you continue to exert this control on the f7 square and this light square diagonal. You don't necessarily have to take here, and in fact, our opponent does not. He just pushes c6. No doubt looking for bishop b7 and maybe queen c7 or queen b6, looking to add pressure onto these diagonals. We play c5. And the whole point here is to soften the position. Tal was ready for d5, simply just pawn takes back. And while this pawn is defended, notice that the e pawn is hanging, pawn takes, defended by the knight and the rook. And now this pawn's going to fall as well. And Wolfgang's position is completely destroyed. You can't push the pawn. If you do take, right, so let's say you take this pawn, that's no big deal either. Just d takes e, and you see that this position is now open for white, and you can't take this pawn back. So we're rerouting his knight. And where does the knight go? Really, he's either retreating or he's going to play h5 on the rim. So this knight becomes very misplaced quickly. And notice that the bishops are now eyeing down the king side. This would be a losing position for sure. And he doesn't play into that. He plays queen c7 instead. And this is fine. I think Tal was ready for bishop b7 as well. Either way, his point is this: takes, bishop takes, and then bishop g5, pinning absolutely nothing. But the idea here is actually pretty interesting. So the whole point here is, let's say bishop b7, which was the idea that Tal was prepared for the entire time. It makes a lot of sense. You're going to try to open up this diagonal and attack on the light squares. Tal was prepared to play d takes e. Now, remember when I told you the importance of these bishops here? Well, the whole point is that if you take with the bishop, knight takes back, and here Tal now has the bishop pair, and Wolfgang has two knights, and yes, they're both worth 3 points of material, but these bishops take up a lot more space, and for that reason, Tal much preferred the bishops. If you don't give up the bishop pair and you instead play knight takes, notice bishop takes, significantly weakening the king side. This is a big fat target for Mikhail Tal to completely destroy. And either way, it's not very good for our opponent. So here, c5. And you can still play e5 here. Tal actually chooses to just take the pawn. And I think he felt as though after bishop takes, there wasn't a lot of counterplay and knight c3 can be played. For the tempting idea of just knight to d5. Just a nice central knight. Either way, the bishop goes to b7, and we play rook to c1. And you can see that at some point, we're going to exert massive pressure on this bishop. There is a weakness on the e4 pawn that you have to watch out for, but we are defending it relatively well. But guys, either way, queen to b6. Exploiting the obvious weakness on Tal's f2 square. But Tal finds a nice move here. Rook e2, which is a perfectly placed rook. It defends all three weaknesses on the position, right? Like rook e4, f2, and then b2. All three of these weaknesses are defended at once. So the rook on e2 is actually really nicely placed. The rook comes out to e8 because now there's concern over black's e5 pawn. But here, a drastic mistake by Wolfgang Unziger. Even grandmasters make mistakes, and here you have an inexplicable weakening of the f7 pawn, and Tal strikes immediately. Knight d5, bishop takes, and here bishop takes back. If the knight takes, right, queen takes back, and here we actually have a fork attacking three different pieces at once, and you actually can't defend everything. It's not a very nice position. So Tal calculated this. He knew that the bishop wasn't going to get taken right away, and instead our opponent is going to play rook to d8, defending himself from this light squared attack, but also defending the knight, right? And now rook to c2. The thing with this move is it defends the knight, but it also pins the other knight. So this bishop's not going anywhere anytime soon, and Tal uses that extra time to double up the rooks on the c-file. A massive attack is brewing. The bishop will have to move out of the way, and he does. Bishop e7, unpinning the knight. Rook c6. Tal is just too quick. You would love to get rid of this bishop, but you have to defend the queen first. Queen a5, bishop d2. Ruthlessly just chasing down the queen. And the bishop actually very nicely defends a2. The queen doesn't have anywhere that great to go. And queen a4 would eventually be a trade down, but here just b4. Trying to exert some pressure with this pawn, maybe storm the A and B files. I'm not sure what Wolfgang Unziger was thinking, but I know that he didn't want to trade down here because these A pawns would have been a liability later on. Bishop f7. Mikhail Tal plays bishop f7. Guys, he's forking the rook and the king. The king can take back, but queen b3 and Wolfgang Unziger resigns because the king has to move over to f8. It's forced. But now we have knight g5, and it is almost impossible to stop checkmate. You would literally have to move your knight in front, and here pawn takes. After bishop takes back, attacking the rook. And if you were to defend the rook and move out of the way, we have d6. Bishop e7 is coming, and this position is completely unwinnable for black. While we can all agree that that game was absolutely amazing, I need to take you back to 1956 Sweden, Mikhail Tal versus Borislav Ivik. And once again, nothing new here. The Ruy Lopez, right? E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6. In this situation, bishop B5, and after A6, we all know what Tal's plan is. Bishop A4, looking for that patented reroute to either b3 or even c2. The game continues, knight to f6, attacking the pawn, but after we castle, we know that this pawn is not takeable. Instead, we get bishop e7, rook e1, and then after b5, bishop b3, and castles. I promise these are different games. At the end of the day, this is just the theory of the Ruy Lopez. This is the right way to play, and most of the time, you're going to find yourself in these types of positions. Why this position is so good is because the activity of the bishops and the fact that we're going to have a very active attack on the king side. Either way, we play c3. Now, we know that d4 is the idea to break open the center, get a bishop on b2, or keep the bishop on c1, and we're going to try to eye down the king side. However, we also have an escape route on c2 just in case the bishop gets in trouble, because the bishop is just as good here on this diagonal. Either way, we see d6, pawn h3, preventing this g4 outpost from transpiring, and then knight to a5, bishop c2. So obviously, Borislav would like to trade off the knight for the bishop here, but Tal is not looking for that. He knows that after this position breaks off, this light square bishop is going to become very powerful. Despite the fact that it's really not staring at much, a pawn on a4, blocking off a4, and then our own pawn here on e4. But eventually, after this position breaks open, this light square bishop will become useful. I can almost guarantee it. We see c5, and now pushing the center, like I said, d4. Knight, queen, all ready to attack, as well as his extra pawn on c3, making the whole idea work. If this position breaks open, Borislav's in a lot of trouble, and he's no slouch. He's still a grandmaster, an excellent player, and he's going to play queen c7. Slightly dubious idea with the point of possibly creating pressure on h2 down the line, and he doesn't want to break open this position. If he did break open the position, it would look something like this, and knight takes. And here, I mean, look at the activity of these bishops, and even something like b3 and bishop b2 is coming. And the queen is very active. The knight's going to get involved very quickly. This position is very bad for our opponents. So he does not want to actually open up that position. You can see that it ends very poorly for him. Either way, knight to d2. And after bishop to d7, we get knight f1. This looks very dubious, but I have to tell you, the first 13 moves of this game, after rook fe8, right here, 13 moves, complete book theory. This is just how you play the position. The idea is we're going to try to exert pressure on e4, and the response will be putting the knight on e3. A masterful reroute where we're going to have a lot of control over pretty much all of the center squares. And it's going to be a battle, a tactical battle, but there will be a winner. And Tal, after playing knight e3, is hoping that he's going to be the winner. Of course, we see g6. Now, g6 may be a little dubious, but the game within the game here is what I'll say. So, Mikhail Tal knows that Borislav Ivik actually played a game in this exact position, and he lost the game because after the center broke down, he had bishop to h7, and then the queen and knight were able to formulate an attack and win the game. So, Borislav is playing a game within the game here. He knows that Tal knows that h7 is a weakness, and he's covering it up early because he knows that the center is going to break open. That just shows you how prepared and how brilliant these chess players truly are. But here, b4 is played. Lots of pressure on c5, and we're also attacking this knight. So are you going to move the knight or are you going to take? In this case, takes, and then knight to c4. Knight takes, pawn takes, and Tal's given up a passer. He's given up a passer. There is an imbalance in the position. Of course, this passer will be very hard to defend, and the center's wide open, right? Like eventually, d takes e will be played at the right moment, and even bishop b2, and it's going to be tough. Even queen d4, and you'd have a bishop queen battering ram on the dark square diagonal. So you have to watch out for these ideas. And here, rook e3. challenging c3. He's saying play c3. I'm not afraid because I'll play rook b1, and my next move will be rook b3 or bishop a4 first in order to prevent the bishop from getting involved. And I'm going to win this pawn back. It's no problem. So he was basically preparing for that c3 push because it is a passed pawn and you do have to be prepared for it. However, we get a more passive, dubious bishop f8 with the idea of going to either g7 or h6. H6 would be an interesting idea because you'd actually force a trade of the bishops because rook moves and then bishop takes bishop. Tal is ready for that and he plays bishop b2. Um, and the whole point is he's trying to route his bishop to c3 and open up this position. Eventually, he's preparing this d takes e idea, and there's just too much pressure on the pawns. Of course, bishop to h6 is played anyway, and rook a3. And just analyzing this position, this bishop looks very menacing, but really, what is the bishop attacking is what I'd ask. What is it attacking? And the answer is it's not really pointing at anything. It has control over the dark square diagonals, but it's now misplaced and even a target later on. Meanwhile, Tal is also threatening d takes e, where after the pawn takes back, maybe even something like rook a5, defended by the pawn, and he would actually win this pawn back and have a massive advantage. With that in mind, queen to b7, trying to target e4. Though this could be considered a misallocation of resources because it doesn't really stop Tal's idea here. D takes e, and then queen takes b4. It's what Tal would explain as a misguided counterattack because you don't have to move the bishop and basically compromise the rook here. You can just play queen d4. And now this battering ram, which is looking really menacing, is on the horizon. You have to move the knight. If you take with the pawn, the knight takes, and this is also just tragically losing. If the bishop was on g7, you'd be in a little bit better shape. Maybe you can get in knight h5. But as black, you're just not quick enough here. And you have to act accordingly, right? So in this situation, instead, just knight to h5, which turns out to be a blunder. The idea is most likely to just get the knight out of the way because you don't want to put the knight back to literally any of these squares. Look, the knight had nowhere to go. You don't want to bring it back to what, like g4, and then the pawn just takes. D5, pawn takes. So you actually are forced to play knight h5. The best line for Borislav is actually to lose the knight. But either way, Tal continues his attack. E takes d now, and then after bishop to g7, pushing the pawn. This is a solid structure, triple defended. The rooks can come to the e file as well, and Tal has a massive advantage both tactically and structurally. Meanwhile, this knight isn't going anywhere. It's basically in jail. Bishop to c6, trying to attack this knight. And Tal's fine with that. Just moves the rook over to e3 after bishop takes. Not rook takes bishop, but bishop to c3. This is where he wanted to go all along with his bishop. And he gets to do it with style because now he's attacking the queen. Queen moves over and then pawn takes. Now the king is wide open, but black's pieces are not really available to actually attack the king side. There's not enough mobility for black, and he's not quick enough to actually capitalize on this. With that in mind, rook to d7 is the idea here. Just trying to get his rooks to the center of the board. Principled play, only down a pawn. But that's not what it's about. It's about the position. F4, adding another defender to the center. These are basically two passed pawns. The F pawn can maybe intercept the E pawn, but even after pawn takes back, Tal's looking for promotions here, and you're not going to be able to do much. Rook E6. And maybe he's looking to double up the rooks here. I'm not sure. But rook b1 at the perfect moment, chasing the queen off the b file. The queen moves over, and then we have rook b6, defended by the queen on d4. And the queen is forced to move. Now, if you analyze this position, Tal's pieces are in all the right places. And really, it's a question of what's going to happen now. Is he going to promote or is he going to strike the king? Here, bishop to d1, trying to open up that king side, and noticing that this knight can't go anywhere, right? Like, best you can do is maybe knight takes f4. And at the very least, you're not opening up the king side. Of course, that's not what was played. Instead, bishop to h6, trying to double attack this pawn because he wants to release this knight that's hanging on the edge of h5 with nowhere to escape to. But he's too late. He's way too late. Bishop takes h5, pawn takes, and here, guys, the move that makes Borislav Ikov resign, f5, sacrificing the rook. He sacrifices the rook here, and you don't even know what's going to happen because Borislav Ivak actually resigns. He says, I'm done. Game over. Um, if bishop takes rook, queen takes e3. The rook is forced to go back to e8 because all these squares are covered here. And now you have queen g5. And very soon, this will be checkmate, game over. There's nothing you can do to stop this. It's inevitable. You're done. It's game over. So with that in mind, you actually can't take the rook. If you move the rook back immediately, we play e6. And the idea here is simple. This is also an inevitable checkmate. If you push f6, queen takes, and listen, you can't stop this. If you put, I don't even know what you would do. Let's say the rook can go to d7, right? And pretend the pawn wasn't here because you can just take it the pawn. Queen h8. And the king's done. It's game over. The pawn is blocking off the escape square on f7. This is absolutely masterful. Now for the grand finale, we have Mikhail Tal versus Rainer Knock, 1974 Germany. An absolutely amazing game between two talented grandmasters. Once again, we're going to go into the Ruy Lopez. This is pretty much business as usual at this point. We've seen this position quite a lot, and we know the ideas. Here, a6, bishop moves back, and d6. After castling, the knight would normally be on f6, but in this case, the bishop comes out in order to defend the knight, just in case Tal wants to double up the pawns. In this situation, d4, immediately pushing the center. So Tal's playing a little differently here. He's playing a younger grandmaster, a very talented grandmaster, but he wants to throw him off, and he's trying to take him out of theory as soon as possible. The last game we played was 13 moves of theory. This game moves out of theory right away with a bit of a dubious idea. After knight to f6, bishop c6. Now, I know. Don't hate me. Let me explain. Listen, I know that if you were to take this knight, the whole point is to double up the pawns. So why is Tal doing it now? And doesn't Tal like his bishops? Wouldn't he want to go to b3 or c2? Yes. But at the end of the day, these guys are just on a different level. Tal calculated that in this situation, Rainer Knock would be in a position that is not familiar to him, a position that has never been played before. In fact, a novelty. This is the first time this move order has been played. And his whole idea was to move him out of theory and placing the bishop in a really awkward spot where maybe d5 can be pushed later on. Either way, the rook comes to e1. Notice that yes, the knight can take here, but then you would have d5, and the bishop is now completely away from the defense of the knight. And the whole point is these pawns on the e file are very difficult to stop. You can't usually take them. Bishop e7, and Ryder Knock is attempting to play theory. He wants to castle at some point, but look at this: e takes d. Knight takes back, and Tal is now completely controlling the center. So he's won the battle for the center. It's completely his. And now it's time to push that advantage. The knight's going to move back because knight takes bishop would have been bad. Obviously, the pawns double up. And Tal continues. Queen f3. And to me, this is a trap. The whole point is it looks like bishop to g4 is the natural continuation and just a great move, but actually it causes some problems. Queen g3. And now if you move that bishop out of the way, g7 is hanging. And you're going to have some issues here. Ryder Knock is going to do two things at once. He's going to defend the bishop with his queen, and he's preparing a long castle. Because if you long castle, it doesn't really matter if you take this g7 pawn anymore. Tal's prepared, and I'm sure you can guess the next move, h3. I'm trying to force the bishop off the defense of this pawn. Knock goes back to h5, and here, knight to f5. He's trying to target this dark square bishop, which seems like an awkward move, but knowing that his opponent's going to castle, we now have bishop g5. And the point is this: if we're able to consolidate and maybe play knight takes, we could actually attack this bishop. And we're also going to be putting pressure on his minor pieces as well, the bishop and the knight. He's expecting knight to g8, which preemptively defends the bishop. After bishop takes, knight takes back, and here you end up in an even trade. But actually, look at this bishop on h5. Would you believe me if I told you that this bishop is trapped and will never move again? Yeah, so here it is. Queen g5. We're actually forking the knight and the bishop. And the point is, yes, the knight can take the knight, but pawn takes back. And look at this. The bishop is completely and utterly trapped. There is nowhere for the bishop to go. The only thing you can do to maybe prolong the inevitable is g6, but then g4. And yeah, Tal is just trapped a Grandmaster's bishop. He just gone. Yeah, I mean, yeah. There's not even a rush. Like queen to c6. He's not going to take this bishop. He doesn't care. f6. He's creating an outpost. He's just going to create an outpost. He's like, I'll take this bishop whenever I want. I'm not in a rush. I'm not in a rush. He creates an outpost. And after d5, just trying to at least push the passed pawn, rook e7, h6, trying to chase the queen away, and then queen e5, doubling up the queen and the rook, and adding pressure to c7. If this queen goes anywhere, it could be maiden 1. You have to watch out for that idea. So just d4, the knight goes to e2, adding an attacker d4, and here, rook to d5. A desperate attempt at counterplay. He's trying his very best to make use of a completely lost position where his bishop is trapped. At some point, pawn takes, and at least the g file is open, and maybe we can pressure the queen. But guys, Tal is the most brilliant chess player of his time, the 8th world champion, and he's a veteran, and he's not afraid of rook d5 because he has knight d4. Guys, he has knight d4. If rook takes queen, knight takes queen, rook takes back, knight check, take with check. After the king moves over, we win the bishop, and in short order, we've just won the game. Yep, pawn takes back, no problem. King h2, not g2. King h2. Not that it matters because the knight came and go to g8, but you guys get my point. You can't survive this. So we know the queen, even though it's hanging, you can't really take it. If rook takes knight, well, queen takes rook, and it's actually the same exact position. I mean, this bishop's still trapped. Tal's up a pawn too. So the bishop's trapped, Tal's up a pawn, and he's up in exchange, and this bishop's going to be lost at some point. So this game's completely over, and because of that, Reiner Knock resigns. But listen, guys, in all seriousness, as we come to the end of the year and we're in the holidays, I'm very grateful to be learning chess with all of you. This has been an amazing experience. Let me know in the comment section which opening you want to see next. I'm here to educate you, and in 2025, I want to bring my game and your game to the next level. I'm also attaching some openings down below that I think would be useful as well. Happy holidays, happy new year. Until next time, stay classy, my friends.